The reason Paul is riveted here on this truth of justification by faith alone, apart from works, is because it opens the door of salvation to all the peoples of the world, whether they're Jews or not.
Why is the doctrine of justification by faith so foundational to Christianity? In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper examines Romans 4:9-12 to reveal the treasure of good news found in this doctrine. This sermon was originally preached at Bethlehem Baptist Church on August 22nd, 1999.
Paul is riveted here on this truth because he wants us to see and get right the proper place of works and obedience in the Christian life in relation to justification. Justification, getting right with God by faith alone, apart from works, undercuts boasting, gets a blessing, glorifies God. Well, what then about works? What about obedience? What about circumcision? What about the other things that the law has to teach us? And in this text, Paul now, in verse 11, draws out a proper positioning of works in relation to those things. How does he do it? Let's read it. Verse 11. Abraham received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while uncircumcised. Well, now, do you see what he's saying here about the place of the obedience of circumcision? Here is the promise made as Abraham looks up into the sky. He trusts God for doing the impossible, and God credits his helpless childlike trust to him as righteousness. Years later comes this command to be circumcised, and now Paul puts on it two names which describe how the law or works relate to faith and justification. Word number one, sign. Word number two, seal. Let's read it again so you see I'm not making those up with some kind of alliterative flourish here. He received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of faith which he already had while he was still uncircumcised. Now this is a tremendously important, programmatic, theological statement about how your life today, Christian, relates to what happened to you when you got saved. Your life today, call it one big circumcision. The cutting away of the old while the new comes into being is not the foundation of your justification with God. It is the sign of the foundation of the justification of God. Namely, the righteousness of God imputed to you through faith alone, which you had before you did one good deed. Because, just to put in a little explanatory parenthesis, there are no good deeds that don't come from faith. And therefore, you gotta have faith before you can do a good deed. And therefore, if you get right with God by faith, you have to get right with God before you do any good deed. There ain't no such thing as good deeds before faith. There is only disobedience. They look good. Believe me, they look good. But they are rebel imitations of an unbelieving heart. Therefore, we are right with God one way, faith alone. What then, John Piper, becomes of obedience? What becomes of works? For example, circumcision if you're a Jew. Answer, call it sign. And you'll get it right. We need to obey. We need to be transformed. We need to become more and more like Jesus so that there will be signs, evidences, fruit to show that the tree is good. That is, there was faith and there is faith. So now you have some words. Words are so helpful. As maddening as they can be, you have some here. Call your struggles for obedience and the fight sign. Don't call it foundation. Don't call it instrument of getting right with God. Don't call it means of justification. Call it evidence. Call it sign. Call it fruit. Call it what it is, but don't get it underneath faith. Because if you do, you will be in bondage for the rest of your life, trying to be good enough for God to accept you. And you can't be. Ever. So if there's going to be any acceptance with God, any blessing, any good news, any peace, our righteousness must be imputed to us from God through Christ by faith apart from works. And that's why Paul is riveted here. It orients obedience in the right place. Subsequent and sign-like, not prior and foundation. Finally, the reason Paul is riveted here on this truth of justification by faith alone, apart from works, is because it opens the door of salvation to all the peoples of the world, whether they're Jews or not. All the white folks and all the black folks and all the yellow folks and all the red folks and every sub-ethnic group among the races, Hispanic and Asian and Somali and Ethiopian and Turkish and Kosovar and Kazakh and Uzbek and Maninka and Sukumu. Let's see it. Verse 11. Listen, now we'll read it all the way to the end and watch Paul begin to burn in his passion as the first great suffering missionary. Abraham received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of faith which he had while uncircumcised, so that he might be the father of all who believe without being circumcised. That righteousness might be credited to them. Do you see the magnitude of the door he just opened? I looked over here in the first service and I saw the porches, and I looked back there and I saw the Johnsons. I looked everywhere, I saw missionaries. So here I'm looking out and they're missionaries, and they're missionaries in the making. And I was so thankful that a visitor walked up at the end of the last service and he said, "You stirred up in me something that hasn't been stirred up for a long time. Namely, a desire to share my faith." And I just wanted to weep with joy. Yes! You got it? Because this last reason, why is Paul so riveted on this doctrine? That there is a righteousness from God through Christ to be imputed to us by faith alone, apart from works like circumcision, Why is he so fixated on this? Circumcision stands basically for Judaism, with all of its dietary laws and all of its sacrificial system and all of its rituals and all of its temple sacrifices. And under that weight, Judaism in the Old Testament times could not be the kind of missionary religion that someday God's people were destined to be. How do you transport the tabernacle? How do you take circumcision? How do you take all these dietary restrictions? How do you take all these ceremonial things to Papua New Guinea with the Bluets? And commend them to all the tribes. Untold number of languages there in those islands. There's no way it's going to happen. Judaism in the Old Testament was, by and large, a come-see religion, not a go-tell religion. I say by and large only. The Queen of the South will come from the ends of the earth to behold the wisdom of Solomon. And she will behold his great castle and this wonderful thing that he's done in expanding the kingdom. And she will say, your God is great and your wisdom is great. And then she goes home. That's the kind of evangelism that by and large happened in the Old Testament. Now Paul's heart burns with another passion. That's Paul's passion, and that's why he cares about this doctrine. Because he looked, and when he saw that chapter 15 comes before chapter 17, and that the reckoning of righteousness and the establishing of a covenant relationship with this pagan Ur of the Chaldees moon worshiper happens through faith alone, and then he sees the law beginning here in circumcision, coming years later, he thinks and he says, yes, the real thing, the essence of the matter, real unity with God, comes apart from those things. And there was a great battle fought in Acts chapter 15 over this, was there not? And Paul, praise God, won that battle because God was on his side. And now circumcision, that is Judaism, is not required. You don't have to be a proselyte, not even a kosher proselyte, to be a part of the children of Abraham. You see that? He became the father of all those, including those who were not circumcised, but had the faith of Abraham. That's the point here. We're going to see more and more of this. Our message now is perfectly suited for every people group, every color, every socioeconomic level. Because the one thing, according to Paul's message, that gets you right with God and sets you on the sign, seal form of life called Christianity is faith. And what is faith? It is the most accessible act of the human heart in the universe. Nothing is easier than faith. Because it is a non-thing almost. It is anybody can do that. You don't need legs. You don't need balance. Fall on Jesus. Rest in Jesus. Depend on a righteousness that is not your own. This is not hard. This is not bad news. This is not a burden. Do you remember the heart of Jesus as he looked into the eyes of the lawyers and the Pharisees and the scribes of his day, and you could almost see fire shooting out of his eyes when he said, you load men with burdens so heavy they cannot bear, and you don't lift one finger to help them. That is not what Paul is doing in these chapters. He is laboring and laboring and laboring to lift your load off of you and put it 12 years down the line called sign. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is, say it, and my burden is, there is one, there is a yoke, there is a burden, there is obedience to be done, but it is sign and it is seal of a glorious reality possessed in the easiest possible way that has no cultural hindrances, no educational hindrances, no ethnic, racial hindrances. The only hindrance is pride. Everybody can trust Christ if they just will. There's no performance of ritual here. There's no performance of an educational level here. There's no performance of a cultural status here. The reason why Paul is excited about an imputed righteousness from God given to people apart from works through faith alone is because he's an evangelist. He's a missionary. He cares about Spain. He cares about England. He cares about America. And he's on his way no matter what it costs. So that when they tried to stop him from going, he said, I'm ready to die in Jerusalem. Don't you get it? Don't you get it? I've got a glorious message for every people group in the world, and I'm on planet Earth to get it to them so that they can stop making much of themselves and have the everlasting joy of making much of God. Put away boasting by means of faith alone. Get a blessing, imputed righteousness and forgiveness by means of faith alone. Get your obedience oriented in the right place after justification as sign of faith, not under justification as basis. And be about the business of telling this glorious news to everybody you can. Because there is nobody whose race or whose educational standing, or maybe the hardest of all, track record, whose track record of raunchiness has to exclude them. Nobody. God is able to bring anybody to the simplest of all acts, dependence on mercy. Now I want us to sing. I didn't quote it earlier, but I'm going to quote it now and make my application and then sing. Charles Wesley, oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing. Third verse. He breaks the power of canceled sin. Do you hear the megaton of theology in that phrase? He breaks the power of canceled sin. First you got canceled sin. Then you got broken sin. And this comes before this. You get that? And if this isn't canceled in your life by means of faith alone, apart from works alone, you'll never break its power. If you try to get these flip-flopped, like so many people do, it's called legalism, and say, I'm going to break the power of this thing so God will like me, you'll be in bondage all your life. But if you will let Christ cancel your sins by resting in Him alone, and receive a free, imputed righteousness of God through Christ from Him by faith alone, then maybe 12 years from now, it'll be broken. And if you say, whoop, you got that much patience in this church? Try us. 12 years of warfare is not 12 years of nothing. And the warfare counts with God as a sign as well as the victory. And now receive a benediction. And let me just put it like this. May the Lord remove from you all boasting, except in the Lord, by faith alone. And may the Lord grant to you a blessing of imputed righteousness by faith alone. And may the Lord help you to see where obedience fits in as sign and seal rather than foundation of your standing with God. And may you all have a passion to share this message with all the people and all the peoples that you possibly can. And all the people said, Amen.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper continues our 13-part series, Faith That Justifies, with a sermon titled, Christians Are Heirs of the World. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.